So welcome everybody again to this training on the political economy of housing. My name is Melissa Marichal, and I'm a staff attorney at the Fair Housing Center here in Connecticut. And we're joined by Marika Dias and Sam Stein from New York. But before we get into the training tonight, I just wanted to also remind folks that we also have another event coming up on the 15th of February at 6 p.m. That is a kickoff of our coalition campaign to make sure that the newly passed Right to Counsel program in Connecticut is fully funded and made permanent. So we were able to win through organizing in our coalition campaign last spring this important legislation that will provide legal representation to our tenants that are facing eviction in our state. And the program is starting to be rolled out. The rollout will officially start this coming Monday, which we're really excited about, but it is a phased in program starting with a few zip codes and then increasing. Right now we have 2 years of federal funding that is providing the dollars to get this program often across the state, but we need to fight for full funding that can cover all tenants that are in need of this legal representation when their housing is at risk. So we'll have that event coming up on the 15th of February. And in the chat, we've included links for you to sign up and to sign up for email updates about other stuff that the coalition is working on. So without further ado, we'll get into the training. So again, my name is Melissa Marichal, and I'm at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. The Connecticut Fair Housing Center is co-hosting this training with the Central Connecticut DSA, as well as the Connecticut Right to Counsel Coalition. We are really, really excited tonight to have Marika Dias from the Urban Justice Center and from the New York City Right to Counsel Coalition, where she's a steering member, as well as Sam Stein, who wrote Capital City and is also at the Community Service Center. Sorry, I keep getting that name messed up. The community, I'm forgetting your full org name now. Sorry about that.
It's Community Service Society, but it's fine.
That's it. Sorry, Sam. Wanted to get that right. Community Service Society, where he is a housing analyst. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to them. And like I said, we're going to hold questions for the Q&A at the end of the training. So thank you again, Marika and Sam, for joining us.
Thank you. So yeah, I think we'll just dive right in because we've got limited time and a huge topic to cover. But it's so great to be here with all of you, and thank you for inviting us. So if we can flick to the next slide, what I'll just do quickly before we dig in is just outline, what we're going to cover. Which is exactly what you see here before you now, this little plan, or not so little actually, a slightly ambitious plan to cover an overview of the history of private property, looking at enclosures, colonization and accumulation, looking at the commodification of housing and the economics of rent, looking at race and housing and cycles of gentrification, and then focusing a little bit in on the role of the state. And of course, interpreters, if we're going too quickly for the interpreting or the closed captioning, please let us know. Feel free to interrupt us and we can slow it down. Okay, so I'm going to start us off. And so I don't know if you want to say anything, Sam, before we begin, or should I just move it forward? Okay, cool. So, okay, so we're going to the next slide then. And so what we're going to talk about, when we hit the next slide is looking at this sort of overview of the history of private property. And yeah, we can go on to the next one. Okay. And so, and the reason we're going to talk about this, just to sort of be clear, is, I think all of you all probably know that land is not, somewhat innately or naturally private property, right? We have a complicated system of laws that turn land into private property and keep it that way. And so even though, for many of us where we're standing right now, it looks like private property is this eternal, universal thing, it really isn't. And that's great, right? Because private property is the source of an incredible amount of misery, human immiseration and frankly death. And so, it's good that it's not eternal. And what we're going to focus on here is the European history of private property, because that's really the system that was exported and violently imposed across the world through colonization, right? And so that's why we're really focused on this particular European form of and history of private property. Okay, so prior to the enclosures, so the enclosures are sort of a critical moment in the history of private property. But prior to the enclosures, what we had was a system of feudalism. And so under feudalism, there wasn't like this understanding that you could have this full title to land, right? That you could kind of buy and sell land, and there wasn't these land titles or registries. Really, the only one who could claim like a complete, absolute right to land in the way that we kind of understand it was the monarch, right? The king or the queen. And what you see here in the picture is a bill of enclosure, which is what I'm going to go on and sort of explain. So we can flick to the next slide. And so the enclosures, it's sometimes explained in different ways, and it's explained in different ways because it was not just a single thing. It was a lot of different strands to it. And in some ways, kind of one way to talk about it is as a landlord movement. As a landlord movement that started in approximately the 1400s, although there's some people are some go into the 1300s, and some a bit later. But started in the 1400s, and basically what landlords started doing was claiming a set of rights to land that previously they had shared with the commoners, right? The folks who weren't lords of the land. And what ensued was like basically this sort of a series of kind of physical battles and legal battles over land. And like in terms of physical battles, landlords literally were building hedges and fences, and then commoners were tearing them down, and then courts were being asked to decide who had the superior claims to land, and sadly, as is still the case today, mostly landlords were winning in the courts. And then so there's lots of lawyers involved, right? Lawyers litigating these cases, lawyers who were in the same, social class as the landlords, and sharing their worldview, litigating and contesting these disputes over land, and helping to establish this new order of things, right? And so by the time we actually had this thing called the Enclosure Acts, which is the thing that people most commonly refer to when they talk about the enclosures, all of these little laws that were passed to privatize little pieces of land here and there, and sometimes bigger tracts. By the time those laws started getting passed in the 1700s, actually most of the land in England had already been enclosed physically through these physical disputes and hedges and so forth. And anyway, we can flick to the next slide if that's okay. What that meant was that for common folks who had previously shared in access to land and had an ability to work on land, they no longer had the ability to produce foods and goods from the land and were forced to work for wages, right? And thus emerged, wage labor and the wage laborer as a class. And yes, that is a great book, The Caliban and the Witch. what ends up happening, and this is a very quick summary, is that, what you have is like rural folks, the commoners migrating to the cities, a kind of building established labor force, which was then serving growing industrialization. And at the same time, you have laws that are really harshly criminalizing vagrancy and forcing people to work for low wages, and the creation of a land market where land can be bought and sold for profit. Right. And so all of this is like really this very huge shift in people's relationship to land and relationships to each other in many ways too, right? But in particular, relating to land, there's no longer this sort of fixed, stable relationship, right? Where you're kind of in a spot, those are your commons, that's the lord of the land with whom you have this relation, and that's where you are. That's where you're at. And so it was really a very substantial shift in people's relationship to land. Okay, so then, right, and I'm not talking about a strict chronology here, right? There are a lot of kind of overlapping periods here, but then we get to colonization, right? And so, while and after all of this is happening, what we have going on is, conquest and settler colonialism, which is exporting and violently imposing this system of private property, to other parts of the world. Right. And securing control of land through theft and various kinds of violence and domination. Right. And so legal concepts, and the law played a really big role. And I see that there's some thing going awry with the slide, but I think we can still see the text, so it's all good. But yeah, I guess somehow we could try not to tamper with the slides. As long as the text is there, it's all fine though. But anyway, so the law is playing a really huge role here. I wonder if I don't think it's me. But anyway, the law is playing a really huge role here, and a lot of the things that we're all still grappling with today, different doctrines and legal concepts, were used to sort of appropriate and steal and justify the theft of land. Okay. So, and as that process is going on, that violence, that domination, private property law is kind of used as being the essence of a civilized society, right? And if you don't have private property as we Europeans understand it, then basically everything that's going on here we see as ripe for the taking, right? Ready to be plucked from its natural state. These concepts of wilderness and naturalness were deployed strategically and abusively to be able to appropriate land that was otherwise being improved and occupied by a whole bunch of other Indigenous people, right? Cool. And so then, the other piece of it is that there was obviously all of these other legal systems for dividing and controlling the land once it had been appropriated. And a lot of those systems are what we also grapple with today, right? Deeds, systems, depending on which state you live in, deeds, a torrent system, different systems that were used and developed during colonization that are sort of still pervasive and still utilized today. Okay. And so basically then, and we can switch across. So basically then what you've got is this system where land that had been previously sustained and changed by building, say, roads and cultivating agriculture in different forms and so forth, was seen as, conveniently seen as being natural and uncultivated, and then appropriated. And this kind of idea of private property and the connection to private property was a critical part of establishing this sort of the new colonial legal subjects, building the nation, and establishing a new order with respect to land. And so there was a lot of settling of land here in the US that was regarded as this sort of uncultivated wilderness, and not just in the US, but obviously that's the context we're talking about today. Lots of land grants to settlers, and property ownership, which was regarded as an essential right of legal citizens, right? So this sort of creation of the colonizer, the legal subject. And you'll see here, the US Civil Rights Act of 1866, which was first to articulate the rights of citizens and to include private property rights in that bundle of rights that define what a citizen is, right? And so all of this sort of private property is intrinsically part of the colonial project, and obviously is part of that colonial project in an ongoing way today, right? We are still in an ongoing process of colonization, and obviously the flip side of that, of Indigenous resistance to colonization, both here in the US and throughout the world, in many different parts of the world. Okay, so that's kind of how colonization fits into this picture, and then we're going to move to the next slide, and what we also had happening was slavery, a system of slavery where the labor of enslaved peoples was then used to take that stolen land and turn it into a source of wealth for white colonizers. And so here, we have some history that actually other folks have inserted, because this is a presentation that we originally gave in New York City, and had history that related to that geographic region. And some folks have very kindly inserted a little research here relating to Connecticut, and the fact that Connecticut's colonial wealth was built largely on supplying food, lumber, livestock to slave plantations in the West Indies that produced sugar. And thousands of people, enslaved peoples, were living in Connecticut in the 16 and 1700s during this sort of, period. And later on, textile mills relying on cotton grown by enslaved people in the South, and merchants, many merchants whose names are still pervasive today, profited from the slave trade. Merchants, insurers, newspapers, and so forth. And so this is we're talking about a history, but we're talking about a history that has an ongoing trajectory, and that is very much alive today, in very sort of tangible ways, right? A history that is still being profited on and profited upon, as we speak. Okay, so I'm sorry for rushing through obviously what is really critical and deep material, right? Material that definitely 10 minutes doesn't do justice to, but that's really kind of intended to give you a bit of an overview of some of the foundation, the history that is the foundation for what Sam's going to now go on and talk about. Which is looking at the commodification of housing and rent, and the economics of rent.
Thanks, Marika. It's a lot of history to do in 10 minutes, and that was a very succinct way of pulling it together. I'm going to bring us in some ways into the present and offer some theoretical frameworks and also some demographic information to help ground us in what's going on now. If we can move to the next slide. So we often talk about housing as having been commodified, and that being one of the roots of the problems of housing unaffordability, homelessness, evictions, and more that we face in our cities today. So what do we mean by that? Well, if a commodity is something that's put on the market to be bought and sold, then it must have a value. And in fact, it has two. Any commodity has a use value, which is why somebody wants or needs to have it and what they will do with it. And a commodity has an exchange value, which is how the thing is priced on the market now and in the future. So when we say that something has been commodified, like housing, what we often mean is that its exchange value, its price, has become more important or powerful than its use value. So if we say that all commodities have an exchange and a use value, and through that long historical process that Marika just led us through, we see that housing became a commodity, well, then we can understand housing's use value as being the home and its exchange value being real estate. Often we're talking about the same physical item and conceptual item, housing, but it exists simultaneously as these two things. And then we can, from there, understand landlord-tenant relations and struggle as, among other things, struggle over the primacy of use versus exchange value, or home or real estate in housing. Again, we talk about housing commodification as one of the roots of the crisis that we face now, but it's not like this is a new thing. Housing has been commodified for a very long time, as again, Marika has shown us. Similarly, it's been a financial product for a very long time too, or it's been financialized. At least since the rise of the modern commercial mortgage, people have been treating homes that they own, either because they live in them or because they're landlords, as ways of leveraging debt and credit. So what's new about this moment that we're living in today is really the extent of commodification and financialization. In terms of commodification, the primacy of real estate over the home. In terms of financialization, the decline of other kinds of investment schemes relative to those promised on or premised on asset ownership, specifically here, the ownership of real estate. So other forms of investment are becoming less prevalent in our cities, and real estate investment is growing in proportion. And we have a kind of compounding of financialization, which is called securitization, which is how global financial institutions own pieces of real estate around the world, either through kind of diversified purchases of housing in various cities, or securitized mortgage bonds, which is the stuff we heard about in the lead up to the 2008 mortgage crisis. We've also seen what some scholars are calling the rise of the new tenement landlord, which is when private equity and big corporate buyers are buying up old housing stock in cities and finding new ways to extract profit from that. And then the old tenement landlords, the so-called mom and pops, learning the tricks of the trade from the big guys and intensifying their profit making as well. So that's a snapshot of how we can understand what's going on today. The next slide, we're going to look a little bit at ownership and tenancy in Connecticut. And as Marika said, this presentation was developed first for Right to Counsel lawyers and advocates in New York City. The organizers of the event today were kind enough to help us add some statistics and findings that are relevant to Connecticut. So Connecticut is 1/3 renters and 2/3 owners. That more or less mirrors the breakdown in the United States as a whole, but the ratio is reversed in Connecticut's biggest cities like Bridgeport, Hartford, and New Haven, as you see here. And I'll say that in our local context in New York City, it's also reversed. It's 2/3 renters, 1/3 owners. So the balance of power is very different in these cities and in the state in terms of who owns and who rents. Next slide, please. We also see that the tenancy and ownership ratio varies very strongly by race and ethnicity, with white Connecticutians, I believe is the word, disproportionately being owners rather than renters, and Black and Latino especially, Connecticutians being renters instead of owners. We see this trend playing out in New York City as well, and in many cities around the country. So there is a strong racial imbalance in terms of who owns, who is a landlord versus who is a tenant, and who is a homeowner versus who is a renter. Next slide, please.
Just going to interrupt you, Sam, just to let you know, I think it's Nutmegger, maybe?
All right.
But I mean, we can, you know, discussion can continue in the chat if others disagree with me or prefer Sam's, and I will go to next slide.
Connecticuters. Okay. So now in terms of rent burdens, rent burden is the percentage of people's income that gets put toward rent. The federal government, HUD, says that a person is rent burdened when they pay more than 30% of their income in rent, or a household is rent burdened when they pay more than 30% of their income in rent. We say that people are severely rent burdened when they pay more than 50% of their income in rent. And it's worth pausing here to say that these are historically and politically determined figures. There's no hard economic science that says that you're not rent burdened if you pay 29%. And in fact, older HUD standards were for 25% of income to be considered rent burdened and 20% before that. So we've seen an inflation in what we're expected to pay of our income and rent before being considered rent burdened. But in any case, over half of Connecticut renters pay more than 30% of their income in rent and are therefore considered rent burdened. And over a quarter pay more than 50% of income in rent. We see similar figures in New York City, slightly higher. The median Connecticut renter household income is $42,571, which is significantly lower than the overall Connecticut median income, and especially the homeowner median income. And it is far less than that in cities like Bridgeport and Hartford, especially in New Haven too. And here we see a breakdown of rent burden by race, where we see a similar, if less extreme dynamic playing out in terms of rent burden and race, as we saw in terms of homeownership versus tenancy by race in Connecticut. And I will also say that these figures track closely with what we see in New York and in many other cities as well. So the history of racial capitalism that Marika was laying out before, and that we will return to in a moment, is very much still continuing in our cities today. Next slide, please. So those are demographics of renters. I would love to give you the demographics of landlords, but we don't have them. There's no federal, state, or city agencies that are publishing comprehensive demographic data on Connecticut landlords. Many properties are owned by shell companies, which is one of the reasons why it's so hard to do this, which makes ownership even more difficult to track and analyze. We could talk about why so many properties are owned by shell companies, having to do with landlords shielding themselves from various liabilities, as well as global investment groups kind of passing themselves as small property owners from time to time. But the fact is, we don't have as much information, but I strongly assume that it's not the same demographic as who is a renter in all these cities. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. So we'll slide back from some of that demographic and statistical analysis back into some theory to talk about the economics of rent. So what is rent? There's a colloquial or common definition of rent. Basically, it's what the tenant pays the owner of the building for access to their space, usually on a monthly basis, as in, I paid the rent. Then there's the economist's definition of rent, which is different and kind of interesting. It is, quote, an amount of money earned that exceeds that which is economically or socially necessary. An amount of money earned that exceeds that which is economically or socially necessary. So for economists, when they talk about rent and rent-seeking behavior, they're talking about the ability of somebody to charge more than they need to run the thing, or that society needs to have everybody in this case be housed, simply because they can, because they own a thing that is scarce or has been made scarce. Economists sometimes call this the unearned increment, because the money that's being earned is not as a product of their labor so much as their ability to own a thing that somebody else needs to survive. A further kind of universe within that world of economic rent is what we call monopoly rents. So monopoly rents are economic rents that are derived from monopolies, which can result from either one, the denial of access to an asset, or two, the unique qualities of an asset. Landlords often have monopoly rents for both of these reasons. Of course, they have economic rents because they charge more than it costs to own and run the property. That's the unearned increment. But we also have denial of access to an asset. And we'll talk more about the racially, gendered, and economically discriminatory practices of access to property in this and many other capitalist countries over the years. But then there's the second, which is the unique qualities of an asset. You could say that every home is unique. That may or may not be true in the age of mechanized development, but certainly every piece of land is unique. No two properties can occupy the exact same space. And most of the value of housing comes from the value of the land on which it sits. And most of that value comes from its location relative to other economic activity. Housing that is near or connected by transit lines or highways or roads to places where people work or otherwise want or need to be is what makes the location valuable. And the owner of the property has nothing to do with that. They may or may not have built the housing that's on top of it, but they did not produce the value of the land that is socially produced. But they do control a monopoly rent on what goes on top of that. Okay, we'll go to the next slide now. So how are rents determined? Going back to that colloquial definition of rent, how much the tenant pays each month. The answer depends on the housing type and the regulatory type. In a lot of places, we have three different modes of rent setting all at once. One is what's sometimes called the social rent, which is to say that it's based on your income. In most programs, a social rent is 30% of a household's income. And the government will pay the difference between what the tenant can pay and either what the landlord is charging in the case of private market rental, or in a social housing situation, simply what it costs to operate the property. Examples of social rent systems include public housing in the United States, Section 8 housing, either tenant vouchers or project-based Section 8. We've also added here state RAP vouchers, which is a Connecticut program that honestly I don't know much about, but probably similar to the voucher programs we have in New York, and low-income housing tax credit housing. All of these employ some version of a social rent mechanism. There's also so-called free market rents, which is the rent that's set by the landlord at the price that they bet the market will bear. So the landlord charges as much as they think somebody will pay to live in a particular location and a particular unit of housing. Somewhere in between those two, we have regulated rents, which is usually where the landlord sets an initial rent, but then the change in rent over the years is determined by a city or state authority. In other words, rent control or rent stabilization. Other states and cities, including New York City, have regulated rents. In New York City, half the private market fits under this category. But since 1956, Connecticut law has prohibited municipalities from adopting rent control ordinances. As I understand it, there is a fair rent mechanism that exists in some places, but it's not as either widespread or powerful as a real rent control system would be. On to the next slide, please. So what is the rent supposed to cover, whether it's a social rent, a so-called free market rent, or regulated rent? Well, it's supposed to pay the taxes on the property unless the property owner has some sort of tax exemption or abatement. It's supposed to pay for routine maintenance, as well as deeper structural repairs that have to happen in an emergency or just over time. It pays for labor costs for that work, which is sometimes occasional and sometimes like a permanent superintendent or other building service worker. Sometimes it covers water bills, though not always, and sometimes it covers heat, though not always, or even usually, as I understand it, in Connecticut. Though my understanding is the rent is supposed to cover the mechanism to get water and heat, the piping and the plumbing, etc., radiators. But there's more, and let's go on to the next slide for this. If you're a tenant and you're paying rent, you're also covering your landlord's debt and profit. There is pure profit, which is just extra money, which has nothing. Oops, my slide is blocked. Is that the case for everybody else as well? Okay, thank you. Pure monthly profit, tenants paying more than it costs to run the place and the landlord pocketing the money. That happens quite a bit. But then there's also a kind of complex use of debt to turn ownership of housing into even more money. And this here is a infographic that is from a report I worked on a couple years ago. I just put the link to it in the chat that explains some of these mechanisms. But essentially the pattern that we've been seeing in New York City, and we understand many other places are seeing the same thing, is landlords pulling equity out of their building by refinancing their mortgages, taking that money and buying up more property, and then repeating the process over and over and over. So while taking on inordinate levels of debt would be hard for a single family homeowner who usually takes on debt to reinvest in their home, maybe fix a leak or something structural, for-profit landlords are not so much pulling refinancing and pulling equity out of their home to improve the property so much as to expand their business and profit even more, and doing so on a very large scale. So that's the other thing that the rent is going to, is paying back higher levels of debt so that the landlord can profit even more. Next slide, please. So as a sort of transition between these sections, if you're interested in thinking about this question, please drop your answers in the chat. What are some of the consequences of housing being a commodity that you see in your work and community? The consequences of housing being commoditized that you're seeing in your work or community. I'm seeing houselessness, evictions, gentrification. We're certainly seeing all the same phenomena in New York City as well. So keep thinking about that question, and we will move on to the next section.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Yeah, I feel like there's going to be a lot coming through in the chat on this question because so much flows from commodification. So while folks are dropping in the chat, I'm going to transition us to a section where we'll look a little bit at the racist history and present of housing. And again, this is another one of those topics that, you know, there's a lot that you can read on it, and it's going to be impossible to sort of do it justice in just, you know, a short time. So what I've done is the way that I think about this is in some sort of, I guess, buckets or categories that are by no means definitive, but rather just, I guess, for myself, a tool for sort of thinking of it. And what I'm thinking about when I think about race and housing are a few key things: migration, segregation, exclusion, predation or predatory exploitation, disinvestment and the flip of disinvestment, which is investment, and disposability. And I think it's fair to say that, you know, at all times in, you know, during this history of private property in the US, race has determined folks' access to land and housing, or their lack of access to land and housing. And so what we're going to do is sort of talk through these buckets and just unpack them a little bit. So if we can move to the next slide. So to start with, you know, migration, you know, I think it is characteristic of US history that migration has very much shaped neighborhoods and housing types and prices of housing and so forth. And so that encompasses, you know, European migration, you know, in the 1800s and early 1900s, Black migration, so internal migration, Black migration from the south to the north, Puerto Rican migration, and other, also international migration, right? And different types of housing, you know, can now be identified with certain migrant communities, right? Including, for example, say public housing that went from being, you know, most places a springboard for the white working class to basically being not a springboard for predominantly Black and brown folks who were migrating, for, you know, Black migrants and Puerto Rican migrants. And then what we also see is, of course, in some ways the flip, but also a form of migration, migration away from urban centres of white folks in the sort of 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and so forth, right? This phenomenon of white flight. And that those types of migration have really very much shaped kind of, the housing types and neighbourhoods, but also housing market. And then if we can flip to the next slide, another critical factor has been segregation and exclusion. So I guess I'm assuming I don't need to tell any of you all that the market is racist. And in terms of housing, our system for sort of valuing land and housing and therefore profitability has mostly been defined in terms of proximity to and presence of Black communities, right? And not exclusively Black folks, like also brown, but particularly the proximity to and presence of Black communities. And so segregation and exclusion from housing has therefore occurred through a combination of laws, of violence and threats, and public and private partnerships, right, where we have the state being actively complicit with private actors and ignoring their abuses, and enabling segregation and exclusion. And so if we flick to the next slide, we'll give some examples of this that I'm sure you all will be familiar with. And somebody has very kindly put in for us an example of, a redlining map relating to Hartford. Obviously you all can see, and I've probably seen redlining maps from all over the US and other urban centres. And, a great book to read on this is The Colour of Law. There are many others, but that's one that comes to mind. So, different kind of sanctioned and in most cases legally enshrined kind of forms of segregation, or things that enabled segregation and exclusion, were redlining, urban renewal, racial covenants relating to property that restricted who could and could not own that property on the basis of race, active discrimination to enable or not to enable folks to, move into particular neighbourhoods, whether that's through rental or through ownership. Blockbusting, where the real estate industry takes advantage of white fear and this mode of valuing land in relation to Blackness, and uses that to persuade white people to move out of properties and move out of certain geographic areas that then could be, that Black and brown folks could be predated upon to move into, while devaluing those same neighbourhoods. Obviously, there's been, a massive amount of active violence by white communities to effectuate and enforce segregation. And at the same time, we have the state actually including and fostering white homeowners and white renters in particular areas, right? Through subsidies, through sanctioning of violence, through ignoring of violence, and lack of enforcement around discrimination and so forth. And then if we go to the next slide, what follows is periods that again, I would argue all of these are sort of have some continuity to the present, of predatory exploitation, where what we see are predatory deed sales, and you can in particular read a lot about that in Beryl Satter's book called Family Properties, where the Black folks' quest for home ownership was turned into a way of, to generate hyper profits by predating on them through deed sales. Slumlords, and this we know about very much, prevalent today, rent overcharges, different kinds of fees that poor people are hit with, terrible housing conditions, higher rents being paid in Black and brown neighbourhoods, so folks are actually paying more for less for lesser types of housing, and then that tendency to locate housing near what, you know, in the planning world can be called local unwanted uses, right? Things like sanitation stations and electrical power stations and different things that folks might not want to live around for sort of obvious reasons, and locating housing for Black and brown folks near those sites. And then, of course, you know, we're all familiar with the subprime mortgage crisis and the use of subprime mortgages to exploit Black and brown homeowners and ultimately to dispossess them of property that they had invested in, you know, subsequent to the subprime mortgage crisis. We saw that dispossession. Okay, and then we can move to the next slide. And you know, I will say that you know, just to hark back to the previous slide for a second, obviously the fact that housing is a necessity is a critical piece of how that predatory exploitation can take place, right? People need housing, and so that need for housing, that use value of housing, and that need for home is deployed as something that can, you know, be exploited on. Then, of course, another key characteristic, you know, of our racist housing system is disinvestment and investment, right? And so, you know, cycles of gentrification, which is something that you know, Sam is going to talk more about, where disinvestment becomes a foundation, disinvestment in Black and brown communities becomes a foundation for then increased profits later on. And at the same time, you've got simultaneous investment in white communities, right? Infrastructure, amenities, the private market is investing in the community, you know, there's tax breaks for white developers and so forth. And you have kind of, you know, exclusionary zoning prohibiting the building of low-cost housing in suburban municipalities, and a reliance on local property taxes to fund public schools, which also contributes to investment in some neighbourhoods and disinvestment in others in terms of education. Okay, and then the next slide, which is the final one, and this section of the presentation is really around disposability of communities of colour, right? Communities of colour are regarded as disposable when it comes to housing. Profit has primacy. And so what that means is folks can be displaced for gentrification, and we see that through evictions and buyouts and harassment and construction used to harass people out of their homes and so forth, through rezoning for gentrification, right? State sort of sanctioned methods of achieving gentrification, criminalization through housing conditions, right? And particularly public housing is an example of this, in the war on drugs and mass incarceration, where whole populations of folks from public housing are seen as disposable, and able to be sort of criminalized, and whilst living in terrible housing conditions, and then ultimately, you know, relegated to incarceration. And then, of course, ecological hazards, right? And we've seen this emerging more in recent decades, where we see particularly, you know, low-income housing that's located in these somewhat undesirable sites, you know, also continuing to be located in sites where ecological hazard is likely or has occurred, and housing for white folks not being built in those same places. Cool. So I'm going to, you know, and I, you know, I'm sure there's like a lot we could discuss on these topics, but I'm going to pass it over to Sam, because I can see how we're doing for time, and it's not good. So I'm gonna pass it over to Sam, and we'll continue on, and hopefully there'll be some chance to pick up on some of these topics in the discussion.
Thanks. And
actually, I forgot about the question. Sorry, I totally forgot. You know, actually, yeah, since we don't, you know, we won't have time for discussion, maybe this is a good opportunity actually for this question. If people do see different kinds of racism playing out in housing, you know, in your work or in your community, if you want to go ahead and drop some of those things that you see in the chat, feel free to do that now. Or if you want questions that you might want to, you know, flag for later discussion, feel free to pop those in too.
So it's a very smooth transition from the history and present of racism in housing into cycles of gentrification, which is something that I think we're seeing in a lot of our cities, always paired with its other side, which is disinvestment, gentrification and disinvestment. So we can talk about what some of those things mean. So this is a definition of gentrification. There are many. This one happens to be mine from my book. I define gentrification as the process by which capital is reinvested in urban neighborhoods and poor residents and their cultural products are displaced and replaced by richer people and their preferred aesthetics and amenities. So it has to do with reinvestment in previously disinvested urban neighborhoods and the displacement that results from that. Next slide, please. What are the impacts of gentrification on tenants particularly? Geographers and left urban planners sometimes talk about three types of displacement that can result. One is direct displacement, which is when a tenant is kicked out of their home because their home has been either demolished to be replaced by something else, reconstructed in a way that is, not for them, or renovated to charge more rent than they can afford. So that's a direct displacement from the landlord to the tenant. We also have a kind of secondary displacement that can result nearby the site of the direct displacement. So the rent might rise nearby as more and more of those direct displacements happen, and the character of the neighborhood becomes more bourgeois or high-end. That secondary displacement can come because a landlord's raised the rent on a tenant, simply because there was no high-end new development nearby and richer people were more interested in living in a neighborhood. And the landlord felt like they could raise the rent, and either their tenant will struggle to pay it or they'll find somebody else who will. Or the tenant's landlord doesn't do that, but just the cost of living in a place has gone up so much that the tenant can no longer afford to live there. The cost of food, the cost of laundry, other things that are necessary in a neighborhood get so high that people's rent and incomes don't match up. The final thing is called tertiary displacement, which is a little bit more abstract, but it's basically the loss of life world. So it's when you are not displaced physically from your home, but your economic, social, and cultural ties to a place are severed, even though you managed to remain. So in this case, your landlord didn't raise your rent, you've stayed there, but everybody around you, all the people that made it home beyond your individual unit of housing are gone. And that can feel like displacement as well. So overall, we see rent increases, harassment to get the money for those rent increases, eviction, either formal or informal, landlord imposed or self-initiated when the tenant just picks up and leaves because they can't take it anymore. And we have the loss of socio-spatial communities, meaning family networks, friend networks, economic networks, and cultural networks that exist in a neighborhood or in a city. Next slide, please. We can think of gentrification as happening on a long historical timeline. And I think that fits with the history that Marika has been presenting in both her first and second segments. So this is another way of understanding gentrification, this is also my quote, that places it in that historical frame. Gentrification is the third stage in a long-term process of capital flow in and out of space. First comes investment in a built environment. Second, neighborhood disinvestment and property abandonment. And third, reinvestment in that same place for greater profits. So understood this way, gentrification is the third stage in a long process of capital moving in, out, and back into the same place. If the place was not formerly disinvested, it cannot really be said to be gentrifying. It's just always been a rich neighborhood. Similarly, if a place has been very poor for a very long time, it is in the disinvestment phase rather than in gentrification. There's a slide here, which again comes from the report I referred to before. or graphic here, which shows how landlords make money at every stage of this long-term flow of capital in and out of neighborhoods. Real estate booms rising up to the point of euphoria, the crisis that inevitably follows historically again and again, and then in many places a recovery and a repetition of the process. At each of these stages, there's different ways for different kinds of real estate capital to profit off of the economic trend. Gentrification really is just the third stage, that euphoria that can result after there's already been a period of disinvestment. Okay, next slide, please. So why do these three phases of capital investment, disinvestment, and reinvestment happen when and where they do? The answer is going to be slightly different for each of those three phases. Why does initial investment happen when and where it does? Often initial investment of real estate capital into a place, so the development of new housing, has to do with proximity to other economic activity. And I talked about this before. Real estate development tends to follow other kinds of economic activity, the places where jobs are happening, the places where other kinds of investment is happening. When that is paired with an expansion of infrastructure, which could mean transit and transportation infrastructure, how you get from where the housing is being built to where the jobs are or other things that people need to get to. It also means water, electrical, now internet, all the other things that make it possible. What's important to note about here is that the first thing, proximity to economic activity, has to do mostly with what other capitalists are doing, not the real estate investors, and what the state is making possible. The second one, expansion of infrastructure, has to do with state planning, priorities, capacities, and investment. So real estate capital is really profiting from what all those other actors have already put into a place. So why then would there be disinvestment from that place after so much money has gone into it? One way of thinking about it is that capitalism always requires geographically uneven development. Money tends to flow into one place and out of another at various different times and never settles evenly across all places. We never see an even distribution of investment in cities and suburbs and rural areas in a region all at the same time. In different historical periods, money tends to flow into different kinds of places. A lot of this is either channeled by or regulated by government policy. And some of that was covered in Marika's last presentation on the racist roots of homeownership and landlordism in the United States. It was government policy that subsidized single-family homeownership at a higher rate than it subsidized public housing investment, but certainly public housing maintenance over time. So money comes out of areas when there is more money to be made elsewhere, essentially. And it's a constant seesawing of where and when that is. So then why do we get reinvestment or gentrification? Let's move to the next slide to see. There are economic, social, and political factors involved. Economic factors are often described as rent gaps in the critical or Marxist geography literature. A rent gap is a way of understanding the difference between what a landowner can make off of the property as it exists right now and what they can make off of it if they replace their tenants, if they invest in the building, or if they knock it down and replace it with something else. So it's an economic calculation of what am I getting right now versus what could I get? And landlords close that gap when they feel that they will be able to get enough more from making the change, from evicting the tenants and replacing them with somebody else, from knocking down the building and building something else, that it makes economic sense to do so. When the gap is not big enough, they will not, and then you'll have a prolonged period of disinvestment instead of gentrification. But when those rent gaps exist has to do with actions that the government is taking and actions that capital in general is taking. And this is where we get to deregulation and financialization. So taking away, for example, states or cities' ability to do rent controls. If rent controls are done away with, it's much easier for landlords to close rent gaps, to simply raise rents because they can and because somebody will pay that much to live there, rather than because a rent guidelines board or something else has allowed them to raise the rents. Similarly, financialization allows for a tremendous amount of investment to be made in what otherwise could have been, small tenement properties, for example. Now there's a lot more money on the line and a lot more money to be made. We also see concentration of economic growth in fewer and fewer places in this country and in many other so-called advanced capitalist countries. So 50, 60 years ago, there was a lot more economic dispersal of economic activity throughout various regions. Now it tends to be concentrated in a few very powerful cities. So in the New York region, we've seen deindustrialization of the surrounding area, and then the hyper concentration of the finance, insurance, and real estate industries in New York City. And perhaps you've seen a similar dynamic in Connecticut and in the southern New England region. I grew up in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, which is a classic example of a severely disinvested, no longer industrial city, right next to Providence, which has tried to rebrand itself as a sort of site of cultural capital. So those are economic factors. Relatedly, you have social factors. When you have such concentration of economic growth in just a few cities, you then have migration of more and more people into those cities, some of whom are poor people seeking access to any kind of job, some of whom are the richest people on the planet who are looking for either investment opportunities or working, in the finance sector and in other extremely high-end service industries that are making some of these cities run. You also have sort of what I called social and cultural trends, which is to say, as these things are happening, social ideas about what success looked like change. So, there was a time when success was measured by one's ability to leave the city if you grew up there and go to the suburbs. I think for a lot of people growing up in the suburbs now, the idea of success is to come to the city. And that is not a epiphenomenal fact that has to do with all those social and economic changes that I talked about before, but it does change who comes to cities and why. Of course, there are many political factors as well, and that's going to take us into the next section, which is the role of the state in gentrification. I'm going to focus on regulation and land use, and then pass it to Marika, who's going to look at policing and evictions. So what is the role of the state in gentrification, and what public policies enable gentrification? The answer is a lot. There are a lot of things that the state either does or basically chooses not to do anymore that enable gentrification. One way we can think about this is the retrenchment of rent laws or the non-enforcement of rent laws and building codes and other things that are meant to protect tenants. In New York City, we had several decades where the rent laws were weakened every time they came up for renewal, again and again and again, to the point that we lost 200,000 apartments from the rent stabilization system. We won a major victory in 2019 to stop that bleeding, but we didn't get back those 200,000 apartments. In those, the rents were allowed to rise up to market levels at the will of landlords. That was an active pulling away of state capacity to prevent gentrification in favor of allowing gentrification to happen. We've also seen the neglect of public housing and the slow whittling away of public options for housing in general. We've seen public housing be built, maintained for a few years, and then structurally disinvested for decades. Similarly, we've seen public subsidies go to the creation of affordable housing, which is then allowed to become unaffordable after 15 or 30 years, allowing for windfall profits for the private owners. We have seen tax incentive programs that use public financing to incentivize luxury development or the conversion of affordable housing into very expensive housing. In New York City, according to research that I've just done and will soon be publishing, the city and the state's single largest expenditure on housing is a tax break for luxury development. Our top priority then is paying for people like Donald Trump to build ultra luxury condominiums and rentals, rather than reinvesting in our public housing or building new affordable housing at the rate that we're subsidizing for-profit expensive housing. We also see various kinds of rezonings. Rezonings are changes to zoning rules. Zoning are the rules that set what can be built where and at what heights, and basically the size and shape and use of buildings. It would be too simple to say that rezoning equals gentrification. That's not accurate. But cities that want to get gentrification as an outcome have figured out how to use upzoning, which is allowing for more new development, and downzoning, which is restricting new development, tactically in different places to ensure that gentrification would be the result. And so in a lot of places, that means limiting the ability of affordable housing developers to build in higher income neighborhoods, while expanding the ability of luxury developers to build in low income neighborhoods. All of these mechanisms enable the private capture of public investment in neighborhoods. And that's a key factor in gentrification. Okay, I'll pass it now to Marika to take us into policing and evictions.
Yeah, and so, if we can flick to the next slide, and this is really our last topic before hopefully we'll have at least a few minutes for some questions. So, I mean, in addition to, all of the different measures that Sam spoke about, landowners themselves have state backing to enforce their private property rights, which basically means that they have the backing of the state's monopoly on legally permissible violence. And that, backing takes a variety of forms. On this slide, what we're looking at is one particular form, which is around laws that very overtly kind of enforce private property rights, whether that's criminal laws that, address trespass or property damage. And so basically, if you own property, you have access to a whole architecture of cops and courts and jails, etc., to enforce those private property rights against other people. Similarly, the criminalization of squatting, different civil property laws to address issues between property owners or between property owners and say another actor like the state. And what we have is a state that will decide which property rights it's going to enforce through criminal penalty and which not. So, for example, in New York, at least, if a landlord locks a tenant out of their apartment, that's an illegal lockout case that a tenant can bring in a civil setting. But it's not criminalized in the same way as, say, a person trespassing on land that is privately owned. Right. And so for some things it's considered criminal and there are criminal consequences. And usually that's when the person doing the thing is poor, and or black and brown. And if the person is doing the thing or the actor doing the thing is the landlord, then there's usually not a criminal consequence. There's usually a civil one. If we flip to the next slide, what we also see is the use of policing and state coercion and this monopoly on violence to protect property and the right to profit in property, right? And so we see there's a connection between this and, what Sam was just talking about, gentrification. with this what we see increased policing of people of color in public and commercial spaces in gentrifying neighborhoods, and policing of activities that were previously culturally and socially acceptable and in those neighborhoods, and still are to many of the residents of those neighborhoods, but to a gentrifier, to a landlord who wants to enable gentrification, these are now behaviors that are considered undesirable. The use of police and police surveillance against tenants, particularly in public housing. And then, the other side of this, the criminalization of homelessness through things like quality of life offences and move-alongs and sweeps of homeless encampments. And, we quite unfortunately now have a mayor in New York City who's revived a quality of life task force just yesterday, that will be a collaboration between homeless services and the police, and sanitation, to basically, execute sweeps of homeless encampments and destroy the property of homeless folks. And then finally, and perhaps, most pertinently for you all in some of the struggles that you all are about to engage in your Right to Counsel coalition, the state is also using its power to protect the right of profit through evictions, and using its monopoly on legal violence to ensure that landlords can profit from property by enabling evictions. And so landlords have access to this very elaborate system of landlord-tenant law, of courts, of marshals, etc., to remove tenants from their property when that is what's required to ensure their ability to profit. And really, with evictions, the ultimate threat is one of violence, right? Like, if the tenant doesn't do what is required, or, by allowing themselves to be removed, by leaving of their own accord, they can and will be physically removed by the state, in a violent act, in an eviction. And that's really the power that landlords are wielding when they're in housing court, right? And for the longest time, in New York City, and I know across the nation, that power was largely unmitigated, right? And for us, like, we had, prior to Right to Counsel, we had over 90% of tenants facing off against their landlords without any legal representation in this setting. And roughly 90%, 95% of landlords actually having lawyers, right? So in a massive power imbalance, in a setting where the ultimate threat is one of violence, is one of loss of your home, and all of the consequences that go with that, relating to employment, education, familial ties, health, mental health, everything. And so, that's what makes Right to Counsel such an important intervention. And, it's a critical intervention, and yet one, in New York, when tenants were fighting for, the first Right to Counsel in the nation, they were fighting for that, not because they thought that lawyers we're going to solve all of the issues around private property and gentrification that we've talked about, right? But what they were fighting for was kind of an ability to win on a terrain where tenants had historically been losing en masse, and a terrain that had been turned into a tool of gentrification by the landlord class. And so, for tenants, what they were fighting for was really a chance to win on that terrain, to then be able to engage in these other fights, right? The chance to be able to fight to stay in housing court, to then be able to engage in fights against rezoning or gentrification, or around public housing and housing conditions and so forth. And so for us in New York City, in the last kind of, we're now in our 5th year of implementation of Right to Counsel, we've seen a lot of shifts, and now have won a law to incorporate organizing into Right to Counsel, because it's that legal representation is a critical intervention, but it really relies on the organizing to make it powerful, right? And so without the organizing around evictions, around gentrification, you can't fully disrupt that source of landlord power. And so, I definitely encourage folks everywhere to, get involved in struggles around Right to Counsel, but also to see Right to Counsel as a springboard for building power in ways that can be much more transformative than you can achieve by representing somebody in court. And so, but it's an amazing first step, and I think it has been in New York City played out as a really critical first step to bringing together, building the tenant movement, shall we say. Anyway, so I might stop there because we do have 5 minutes left, and I know there's maybe some announcements, but also maybe hopefully a chance to at least address a question or two.
Thank you so much, Marika, and thank you, Sam. We were so excited for this presentation and for you guys to lay out this framework, because here in Connecticut, we're facing a lot of historic challenges, but also a lot of historic opportunities. We're about to enter our third year of the pandemic emergency. Our last remaining emergency eviction protections expire on the 15th of February, but we also do have this right to counsel movement that we've joined, and that are so excited to see our program start to roll out at the end of this month. And we're also seeing this resurgence in tenant organizing, both here in Connecticut and across the nation. And so we're really excited that we'll have this right to counsel program rolling out, and want to see it expand and implemented strongly so that it can support that organizing, like you were saying, Marika. So one quick announcement for Connecticut attorneys: this training is eligible for MCLE credit. So that's 1.5 hours, 90 minutes of CLE credit. If you have any questions about that, you can email me or anyone at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. And then I guess we have just a few minutes for a few questions. So if you have any questions, you can drop them in the chat. And we've gotten a few questions already. So I have one question that is for either or both of you, Sam and Marika, which is about affordable housing. So audience members wondering, what do you think of the kinds of reforms that are typically offered by affordable housing advocates, like inclusionary zoning, expanded Section 8, or rent control? And are there any affordable housing myths that you think folks should be aware of?
I might leave that with you, Sam, if that's okay. And then I'm going to respond in the chat to something else so we can hopefully capture more things, if that's okay.
Sure. It's hard to paint with a broad brush, because I think some of these tools have more effectiveness in different kinds of places. None of them is a solution to everything that Marika and I talked about. So, for example, I've been very critical of the way that inclusionary zoning was rolled out in New York City, because it basically only upzoned poor and majority people of color neighborhoods for the first 7 years of its existence. Meanwhile, majority white homeowner, low density neighborhoods were allowed to remain such. The whole idea of inclusionary zoning was really to desegregate the suburbs, not to bring white people into majority people of color neighborhoods. So there's a place for inclusionary zoning, but that doesn't mean that it's the best solution to the problems that we have in all places. Section 8 vouchers, again, like there's a way of framing Section 8 vouchers as basically a public subsidy for landlords, and that doesn't really solve our problem. On the other hand, almost no affordable, like social housing, is actually deeply affordable unless it has some mechanism to pay the difference between what the tenant can pay and what it costs to run the place. And often that is a Section 8 voucher. So I don't want to say, that's not appropriate either. So really it's about fighting for power over what the housing system looks like and who controls it. And then you can use the tools that are out there, for all sorts of different ends. But there's no one neat trick that's going to decommodify housing when those in power, are still aiming to make most of their profit from it.
Thanks, Sam. Marika, you dropped some information in the chat, but I'm wondering if maybe you could add a little bit now, and then we'll turn it over to Alice Colotronis to close us out.
Sure, yeah. So, like I was saying, tenants didn't see the right to counsel as the end goal. They saw it as a tool that they were winning. to be able to build the tenant movement and to really grow and build tenant organizing efforts. And so what Right to Counsel enabled in New York City were a few different things. And I think a critical part of this was that when the Right to Counsel Coalition, and I should say, so I have been involved in the Right to Counsel Coalition since 2014, since we first started fighting for Right to Counsel. And we fought for Right to Counsel from 2014 to 2017. Amazing victory, really sort of landmark victory where we won Right to Counsel. And I think the critical piece was that people didn't stop there. They knew that if they were going to realize the vision that they had for Right to Counsel as a tool for organizing, there were a couple of things that had to happen. One, a whole bunch of organizing around how Right to Counsel was done, so that it was not something that just went down the road of, say, the criminal Right to Counsel, which was put into effect in 1968, and then what followed was the rise of mass incarceration on an unprecedented scale, and a sort of gutting of that right in very many substantial ways. And so tenants knew if it was going to be powerful, tenants need to stay involved in determining what it looked like and how it was done, and how do we build a cadre of lawyers that are part of the movement, not just people who hold folks' hands while they get evicted in court, right? And how do we use eviction proceedings and take a Right to Counsel and make it something that we can use to be able to litigate more creatively, to be able to litigate more aggressively, to be able to achieve more in that setting. But then also, how do we take what we're doing in that setting and use it to do different campaigns, right? Campaigns around the city's worst evictors, right? And turning the spotlight away from tenants and saying, well, actually, there are a bunch of folks who are doing these evictions and they're doing them for profit strategically. And it's the same old actors again and again. How do we tie evictions to the issues of bad conditions? How do we look at evictions and public housing? Trying to mount different campaigns. And then when the pandemic came, it was obviously, an incredible tragedy and remains so, and one, entirely socially determined and potentially preventable, but nonetheless was also an incredibly generative period of organizing, where tenants really came together and organized around achieving an eviction moratorium, which tenants maintained up until New York City in some form or another until last weekend, or 2 weekends ago, rather. An amazing achievement, right? And all because of struggle and direct action and people in the streets, and the fight for cancel rent, which was a bill that we wrote and introduced in the Right to Counsel Coalition. We wrote that bill, and that really triggered a lot of struggles, in all different parts of the country, but also was remarkable to get a bill to cancel rent entirely introduced, and to really open up that demand, right, as a viable and real political demand that made sense, and to open up discussions around commodification of housing and the prioritization of profit over people, and to really open up the discourse around evictions and to be fighting for an eviction-free NYC, and that's another one of our websites, and creating eviction defense networks where ultimately the goal is, where court is not a venue where tenants can win, to deploy direct action, to deploy eviction blockades and other forms of direct action. And you all may be familiar with a city like Vida Urbana, who have been using those strategies for many years really effectively. And so the idea is that Right to Counsel is not like a landing place. It's really, in some ways, a starting point to then build on, both in terms of the movement, but also in terms of the different kinds of strategies and tactics that we're using to fight in the way that Sam was describing, right, where we're not going to win with just one thing that we can achieve, but rather we'll need to be deploying lots of different strategies, tactics, movement spaces, coalitions, and so forth. And so that, the Right to Counsel has been incredibly effective in New York City for helping us build all of that. Obviously, that stuff didn't just happen because of Right to Counsel. It happened because of the way that the tenant movement and organizers, and, lawyer allies and legal advocate allies, took the Right to Counsel and used it as a tool to build all of that.
Thank you, Marika. That experience from New York is really helpful to understand, and I hope that we can keep that conversation going. And I will turn over to Alex.
Hi, everybody. My name is Alexander Kolokotronis. I'm the chapter co-chair for Central Connecticut DSA. We have branches in New Haven, in Hartford, in Middletown, and Bridgeport. So if you'd like to get involved with us, please do so. And of course, please join DSA. We're a growing organization, and the work that we're doing here is the work that we want more people to be involved in, whether as allies or directly as part of our organization. I wanted to also first shout out our interpreters for tonight, Juan, Noor, and Carla, and give a thanks to Sam and Marika and to Melissa for moderating. I just really wanted to underscore the points that Marika just made around right to counsel. The bill we passed here in Connecticut is among one of the best in the country, and we now want that to be translated into practice. We don't want to simply have the best legislation in the country. We want to have the best program in the country, and we want that reflected across the country as well. So to do that, though, it really takes a movement, and it'll take a movement that's bigger than the one that brought the initial piece of legislation into existence. And so we are starting effectively a year early in this campaign in order to grow that movement. And so please come out to the February 15th event. That event has a slated set of speakers from a range of organizations. We'll be having Dion Dwyer from PT Partners, a tenant organization in Bridgeport, speaking. Kim Hart from Witnesses to Hunger. Sky Thompson from Unite Here, New England Joint Board, labor union here in Connecticut, and Leslie Blateau from the New Haven Federation of Teachers, as well as John Pollock. So these are slated speakers for February 15th among a growing list. So please come out, hear the different perspectives on why right to counsel is important to different organizations and different constituents across the state. And also, again, of course, join in. So that's February 15th. But again, just as Marika was stating and outlining, we see this as a sort of springboard and something that is operating really in close connection to the work that we're also doing on the ground. So as DSA, we've been organizing tenants, and we've been working to grow the Connecticut Tenants Union. And so please come into the space again to join in on that in order to really get to a place of transforming our system of housing from the system we have right now to one of social housing. We're going to need a powerful tenants movement, and we're going to need various people from across the board involved in growing something like the Connecticut Tenants Union and the Connecticut Tenants Movement. So we don't want simply right to counsel. It starts with right to counsel. We want a system that's completely different in terms of how it operates and addresses most, if not all, of the issues that were brought up tonight, and that'll take a while, but it'll take a lot of intentionality in doing that together. So we're hoping that February 15th will be the start to that. I'm not sure if there's anything else. If not, that'll effectively be us closing out the event, and hope to see you in a few weeks. Thank you, everyone.